All right, joining me now is Ryan Bohl out of Philadelphia. He's a senior Middle East and North Africa analyst at RANE. Ryan, thank you so much for joining us. I want to start off by talking about Trump himself. He's long promoted himself as this peacemaker, but 6 months into his second term, he's not really made progress in Ukraine and Russia, nor in Gaza. How much of a priority is it to the Trump administration that a deal get done, particularly just a couple days ahead of this Netanyahu visit to the White House?
Well, I certainly think that the President Trump would like to get a ceasefire in the Gaza Strip, but he's not willing to pay a political or military cost to do so. The major obstacle to a long-term ceasefire is the Netanyahu government itself. They have become, in a certain way, politically almost addicted to this conflict to keep their coalition together. And that would require the United States to use its significant military leverage over Israel to force them to end combat operations. I simply don't see the Trump administration being willing to flex that leverage against the Israelis. And so in that sense, while I think he is very interested in the legacy issue, he's not willing to do the hard geopolitical work that would be required for an enduring ceasefire.
So let's talk maybe about what could be the sweet spot here. We know that Trump has also long wanted to see an extension of the Abraham Accords, particularly with Saudi Arabia. Now it seems like his eye is on Syria, maybe even Lebanon. Could the prospect of getting these countries to sign on sort of act as a hook for Netanyahu to agree as well? In this scenario, Trump wouldn't have to, as you say, really assert that pressure on Israel.
Well, the issue with that is that he would then need to assert pressure on Saudi or Syria or Lebanon in ways that are significant and could be destabilizing to those countries in different ways. And again, it's very hard to see President Trump willing to do that, particularly to an oil producer like Saudi Arabia, where the idea of normalization with Israel, short of a Palestinian state being established, is enormously unpopular and could entail security risks to the Saudi monarchy. And so even though there are elements of the Saudi royal court that have long been open to normalization, they don't want to take the backlash after October 7th and the subsequent Gaza war. So again, Trump needs to go even further. He can't just offer normalization deals that he's really not in a position to force to happen without doing yet more work, yet more diplomatic efforts with these countries. That being said, the one thing that I am looking for is whether or not President Trump does have the willingness to allow Israel to annex part or all of the West Bank. And this is one of the few ways where perhaps the far right in Netanyahu's coalition might be willing to sign up for a ceasefire in the Gaza Strip if they believe they can finally and firmly control the West Bank in perpetuity with American backing.
Ryan, Hamas is also under intense pressure to agree to a deal. 100+ Palestinians are being killed every day, many of them at aid sites that are sponsored by this Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, though many would argue that that is a euphemism, this humanitarian element to it. Tell us, do you think that Hamas will agree to what is in this ceasefire deal? Would they be more willing to agree now than they were months ago? Tell us just a little bit about that pressure that the group is under.
Well, there are two imperatives that Hamas is grappling with. The first, of course, is their military pressure. And anything that stops military pressure on Hamas and frees them up to deal with some of these criminal gangs and rival clans that are starting to claw away power from them in the Gaza Strip would be welcome. So in a certain sense, from a very tactical sense, a temporary ceasefire would be in their interest, but the emphasis on temporary, because Hamas does not want to look like it is surrendering to the Israelis. And that's what the Israelis are trying to create the narrative of, that Hamas is essentially surrendering to them and preparing to go into exile. And so Hamas might be willing to accept a temporary ceasefire that gets an aid and allows them to combat some rivals and reorganize and rearm. But at the end of the day, I think Hamas still has an interest in continuing the conflict if it results in a political victory over Israel by simply wearing out Israel's political will to continue fighting. And the date to consider for them is October 2026, when the Israelis must have another election. The next government is quite likely to not include Netanyahu, and that next government might be more open to concessions to Hamas on some level that allows them to claim at least a modicum of a political victory in the course of this very disastrous war.
All right, that's Ryan Bohl. Very interesting insights. Thank you so much for your time and your expertise.
Thank you.